My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 42 years old, and until 3 years ago, I thought I understood my family. I'm a marketing director for a mid-size furniture company in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have a husband named Mark, an accountant with steady hands and a steadier temper, and 2 kids, Sophie, 16, and Ben, 12. I drive a 7-year-old Honda Pilot with a crack in the windshield I keep meaning to fix. I make good coffee. I remember birthdays. I am, by every measure that matters to the people who raised me, a reliable person. That reliability, I would learn, was not an asset. It was a resource. And resources get used until someone notices they're being used. This isn't a story about a screaming match or a slammed door. There wasn't a single moment where everything broke. Instead, there was a slow accumulation, a signature here, a phone call there, a spreadsheet I wasn't supposed to see. Until one Tuesday afternoon in October, sitting in my father's dim study with a bank statement in my hand, I understood that the family I'd spent 40 years trying to hold together had already decided years ago what I was worth. I want to tell you how I found out. I want to tell you what I did about it. And I want to tell you what it cost, because I'm not going to pretend it was free. It wasn't. But I'll tell you this now at the start so you know where we're headed. I did not yell. I did not slam a door. I did what I have always done. I paid attention, I kept records, and when the moment came, I told the truth quietly enough that no one could accuse me of losing control. That quiet was the most powerful thing I have ever done. Before I go further, if you're new here, welcome. I tell stories like this one every week, true-to-life stories about families, money, and the quiet reckonings that happen at kitchen tables instead of courtrooms. If you've ever been the reasonable one in your family, the one who smooths things over so everyone else can stay comfortable, I think you'll recognize pieces of yourself in this. Drop a comment and tell me if you have. And if you want more stories like this one, consider subscribing. It helps more than you'd think. And I read every comment, even the long ones. Especially the long ones. Now let me take you back to where this really started 40 years ago, in a house on Cherry Street with a crooked porch step that nobody ever fixed. Cherry Street. I grew up in Grand Rapids, in a narrow 2-story house with a crooked porch step my father always meant to fix and never did. My parents, Robert and Eleanor Bennett, bought that house in 1979, the year after they married, back when my father was laying tile for other men's kitchens instead of running his own crews. He built Bennett Construction from a pickup truck and a set of borrowed tools into a company that, by the time I was in high school, employed 30 people and built half the strip malls between Grand Rapids and Holland. My mother didn't work outside the home, not because she couldn't, but because in the world she'd been raised in, a woman's job was to make the house run and the family look right to the neighbors. She was good at both. Our house was always clean. Our clothes were always ironed. And when people asked how the Bennetts were doing, my mother always said wonderful, in the particular bright voice she used for anyone outside the family, a voice that had nothing to do with how anyone actually felt. I was born in 1984. My brother Daniel came 3 years later in 1987, and from the moment he arrived, something in the house shifted in a way I couldn't name as a child but felt in my body the way you feel a change in weather. My father had wanted a son. He'd said so more than once in front of me, in the offhand way people say true things they don't think will hurt anyone. Every man wants a boy to carry the name. He told a client once at our kitchen table, not noticing or not caring, that I was sitting 6 feet away doing my homework. I was 7. I remember writing my spelling words extra carefully that night, as if neat handwriting might make up the difference. It wasn't that my parents were cruel to me. I want to be fair about that because fairness matters in a story like this one, and because the truth is more complicated than a villain and a victim. My parents loved me. They came to my piano recitals. My mother taught me to bake her mother's pie crust, rolling the dough between 2 sheets of wax paper, the same way her mother had taught her. My father, gruff as he was, used to let me ride in the truck with him on Saturday mornings, drinking hot chocolate from a thermos while he checked on job sites. But there was a current running under all of it, and the current pulled toward Daniel. When Daniel struggled in math, my father hired a tutor. When I struggled in math 2 years earlier, my mother told me to try harder. When Daniel wanted to play hockey, my father built a rink in the backyard with a garden hose and 3 cold January nights of freezing water in thin layers. The way you're supposed to. When I wanted to take gymnastics, my mother said it was too expensive, and then the following spring found $400 for Daniel's hockey equipment without blinking. I don't tell you this to make my childhood sound like a tragedy. It wasn't. I had food, shelter, 2 parents who stayed married for 46 years. A bedroom of my own with yellow curtains I picked out myself. Compared to real hardship, I had it easy, and some part of me has always felt guilty even naming these things as wounds. But children keep score even when adults think they aren't looking. I kept score. I just didn't know yet that the scorekeeping would matter so much later, that the small tilts of a childhood table would still be visible 40 years on in the shape of a will. The good daughter. By the time I was 12, I had learned the family's unspoken rules well enough to follow them without thinking, the way you learn the layout of a dark room. Rule 1. Daniel's feelings were weather. They arrived, they were significant, and everyone adjusted around them. My feelings were more like furniture, present, useful, expected to stay where they were put. Rule 2. I was the responsible one, and that title delivered as praise was actually a job description. If Daniel forgot his cleats, I was the one sent back into the house to find them, because I always knew where things were. If my parents fought, and they did quietly behind their bedroom door, in voices pitched low enough that I had to strain to hear the shape of the argument if not the words, it was me, not Daniel, who was expected to keep things calm afterward. Make breakfast. Ask no questions. Smooth the surface of the morning. Rule 3. Money was never discussed with me directly, but I absorbed its currents anyway. I noticed, in the way children notice everything they're not supposed to, that when the company had a good year, gifts appeared for Daniel, a mountain bike, a trip to hockey camp in Traverse City, before anything appeared for me. I noticed my mother's careful phrase, repeated so often it became a kind of lullaby. We'll even things out eventually, Claire. You know that. I did know that. I believed it, the way you believe things said to you in a calm voice by people who are supposed to love you. I believed it through high school, when I worked a part-time job at a drugstore to save for college, while Daniel's application fees and campus visits were simply paid. No discussion, no ledger kept. I believed it when I got into University of Michigan on a partial academic scholarship and my parents covered the rest without complaint, because, and I heard my mother say this once to my Aunt Carol, thinking I wasn't in earshot, Claire's smart enough to make her own way. Daniel needs more help. I didn't understand yet that being told you're capable is sometimes just another way of being told you're on your own. I studied marketing. I graduated in 2006 with honors and a decent job offer from a firm in Chicago, which I turned down because by then my father's business was hitting a hard patch. 2 projects had gone over budget, a lawsuit from a subcontractor was eating into cash flow, and my mother called me crying, asking if I could just come home for a while until things settle. I came home. I took a lower-paying job at a local agency. I moved back into my childhood bedroom with the yellow curtains, 22 years old, telling myself it was temporary. Daniel, meanwhile, had gone to Michigan State, majored in something called sports management that never seemed to lead anywhere specific, and after graduating in 2010 moved back into the house too, except no one called it temporary for him. No one asked when he was leaving. My father gave him a low-level job at Bennett Construction doing estimates, a job Daniel was, by every account I ever heard from the actual crews, not very good at. I want to pause here and say something important, because it's easy in stories like this to make one sibling a saint and the other a villain, and that isn't true, and it isn't fair to Daniel. Daniel wasn't cruel to me growing up. He wasn't scheming, not then. He was a kid who'd been handed an easier road so many times that he genuinely didn't seem to notice the road was easier, the way you don't notice the temperature of water you've been standing in your whole life. He liked me in his way. He'd defended me from a bully in 7th grade, gotten suspended for it actually, which my father had been oddly proud of. He wasn't a monster. He was just never taught to look for me in a room. And nobody taught him he needed to. I stayed in Grand Rapids. I met Mark Whitfield in 2008 at a friend's barbecue. He was newly certified as a CPA, quiet in the particular way of people who are always doing math in their heads, and the first person outside my own skin who ever said to me within a month of meeting me, "You do an awful lot for people who don't say thank you." I remember laughing it off. I remember also not forgetting it. We married in 2011. Sophie was born in 2010 before the wedding, which my mother never quite got over, though she was too polite to say so outright, preferring instead a long series of comments about how things used to be done that she delivered at holidays for the better part of a decade. Ben came in 2014. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a good school district, the kind of house that takes both incomes and careful budgeting to afford, And Mark and I built a life that looked from the outside exactly like what it was: stable, unglamorous, honest. Daniel married Rachel Coyle in 2013. Rachel is a real estate agent, sharp-edged and image-conscious in a way that made my mother visibly relax the first time they met, as if she recognized a kindred fluency in a language I'd never quite learned to speak. Rachel understood instinctively what mattered to my parents, how things looked. She sent thank you cards on heavy cardstock. She remembered my mother's birthday 3 weeks in advance. She was, in every visible way, better at being a daughter than I was, despite not being one. By 2015, Daniel and Rachel had a son, Nathan, and had moved into a house in East Grand Rapids that my father helped them buy alone. It was called at the time forgivable, informal, the kind of arrangement that exists on a handshake and a family's assumption of trust. I never asked how much. I found out later. I'll get to that. I tell you all of this, the tutoring, the hockey rink, the loan for the house, not because any single piece of it was dramatic. None of it was. That's exactly the point. This is how these things work. Nobody sits a family down and announces, "We have decided to favor one child over the other." It happens in 1,000 small transactions, each one defensible on its own, each one small enough to swallow without choking. It's only years later, when you finally add up the whole column, that you see the total. I didn't add up the column for a long time. I was busy. I had a marriage, 2 children, a mortgage, a job I was good at and mostly liked. I called my parents every Sunday. I drove Sophie and Ben over for dinner most weeks. I organized my mother's 70th birthday party, the invitations, the venue, the cake, while Daniel showed up 40 minutes late with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and somehow received the warmer hug. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I wasn't the kind of person who kept score. I was lying to myself. I had been keeping score since I was 7 years old. I had just never once in 35 years let myself look at the final number. Ed Grady's funeral. In July of 2019, my father's oldest friend and former business partner, Ed Grady, died of a heart attack at 66, on a Sunday morning, mowing his own lawn, the kind of ordinary death that leaves everyone around it saying the same disbelieving sentence. But he seemed so healthy. The funeral was held at a funeral home on the east side of Grand Rapids, the kind with heavy maroon carpet and a guest book on a stand by the door, and I remember my father standing in the receiving line in a suit that no longer quite fit him, shaking hands with men he'd worked alongside for 30 years, his face doing the particular careful work of a man determined not to cry in public. Ed's widow, Sandra, pulled my father aside after the service, and though I wasn't meant to hear it, I was close enough, holding Ben, then 5, on my hip while he fussed with the collar of his little dress shirt. "He never finished the will, Robert," Sandra said, her voice cracking. 20 years we talked about it and he never finished it. The lawyers say it could take 2 years to sort out who gets what. 2 years and everyone already has opinions. My father was quiet the whole drive home. I remember because we'd carpooled that day, my parents and my family together in my father's truck, the kids squeezed in the back seat, and the silence stretched almost the entire 40 minutes, unusual for a man who narrated most drives with a running commentary on other drivers' failures. "That's not going to be us," he said finally, more to the windshield than to anyone in the car. "Whatever else happens, that's not going to be this family, fighting over paperwork for 2 years while everybody's grieving." I remember feeling something like relief at that sentence, sitting in the passenger seat with my father's profile lit by passing streetlights. I didn't yet understand that not fighting over paperwork and being fair were 2 different promises, and that my father, in the weeks that followed, would move quickly and decisively to guarantee the first one without ever quite getting around to guaranteeing the second. Ed Grady's death didn't cause what happened to my inheritance. But it was, I've come to believe, the spark that lit the fuse, the event that turned my father's vague, comfortable intention to even things out eventually into an urgent project with a lawyer's letterhead and a filing deadline, executed by a man who had just watched, up close, what happens to a family when nobody moves fast enough. He moved fast. He simply didn't move fair. And for a long time I don't think he understood there was a difference. The cottage on Higgins Lake. If you want to understand my family, you have to understand the cottage. My grandfather, Walter Bennett, bought 1,100 feet of shoreline on Higgins Lake in 1961, back when land up there was cheap and nobody from Grand Rapids wanted to drive 3 hours north for a weekend. He built the cottage himself, board by board, over 4 summers, and when he died in 1988 he left it to my father, his only child. I was 4 years old the first summer we spent up there as a family, and by the time I was an adult, the cottage wasn't just a building. It was the place every good memory in my family had happened. 4th of July fireworks off the end of the dock. My mother's blueberry pancakes on a griddle older than I was. The summer Daniel and I built a raft out of 2 old doors and pool noodles and nearly drowned trying to launch it. And my father, furious and relieved in the same breath, hauled us both out of the water by our collars. Every summer for 6 weeks, my parents opened the cottage and the whole family rotated through. My parents, Daniel's family, mine, my Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim when they could make the drive from Ohio. It was, without question, the closest thing my family had to sacred ground. In August of 2019, my father called a family meeting, the first of its kind in my adult life, to discuss what he called getting our affairs in order. He was 64 then, healthy as far as any of us knew, but he'd just watched his old business partner, Ed Grady, die of a heart attack at 66 with no will and a mess that took the family 2 years to untangle. My father didn't want that for us. I remember him saying exactly that, at the kitchen table on Cherry Street, with my mother's hand resting on his arm. Everything gets split evenly between the two of you, he said. The cottage, the business, whatever's left when we're gone. I don't want you two fighting over this the way the Gratis did. I believed him. I had no reason not to. I even remember feeling that day a small unclenching in my chest, a hope maybe that the scale I'd felt tilted my whole life might finally be leveling out, at least on paper, at least for the things that mattered most. I didn't know then that evenly split was a sentence my father meant the day he said it and stopped meaning within 18 months. I didn't know that the difference between what people say at a kitchen table and what they sign in a lawyer's office can be the distance between hope and nothing at all. The following summer, 2020, my father retired from active management of Bennett Construction, 61 employees by then, 3 offices, and handed daily operations to Daniel, who was 33 years old and had never run so much as a lemonade stand. I want to be precise here because precision matters. My father didn't sell Daniel the company. He transferred ownership, 60% of the shares outright. The remaining 40% held in trust for the family. Through a corporate restructuring my father's longtime attorney, Howard Ellis, drew up that August. I found out about the restructuring the way I found out about most things in my family, secondhand months later, at a dinner where it was mentioned in passing as though I already knew. Daniel's really stepping up with the company, my mother said one Sunday in October, passing me the green beans. Your father's so relieved to have it in good hands. What does that mean exactly? I asked. In good hands? Oh, you know. Daniel owns it now mostly. Your father kept a piece for insurance, but it's really Daniel's baby now. She said this the way you'd mention a change in the weather. I remember setting down my fork. I remember Mark's hand finding my knee under the table. A small pressure that meant not here, not now. I asked my father directly later that week over the phone, Dad, did you give Daniel the company? I transferred him controlling interest, my father said, in the flat, closing the subject voice he used for anything he didn't want to discuss further. It made sense from a tax standpoint. Howard walked us through it. Nothing's changed for you, Claire. The cottage is still going to both of you. I told myself that was true. I had no evidence yet that it wasn't. And I was 36 years old, with a job and 2 kids and a husband and a mortgage of my own. I did not have the bandwidth or frankly the appetite to interrogate my aging parents' estate planning over a green bean casserole. I let it go. That is the thing nobody tells you about being the reasonable one in a family like mine. Reasonableness isn't a virtue in that house. It's a mechanism. Every time I let something go for now, I was teaching everyone around me, including myself, that letting things go was simply what I did. The fall. In March of 2021, my mother slipped on a patch of black ice in the driveway on Cherry Street and broke her hip. She was 66. The surgery went fine, but the recovery didn't. 6 weeks of physical therapy, a walker she hated, a fear of the stairs that never fully went away even after she was cleared to climb them. I was the one who took 2 weeks off work unpaid to manage her home care schedule, cook meals and drive her to appointments. Mark picked up extra hours to cover the gap in our income. Rachel sent a fruit basket. Daniel visited twice in 6 weeks, both times for under an hour, both times leaving before the hard parts, the physical therapy exercises that made my mother cry, the humiliation of needing help getting to the bathroom, the long afternoons where she just wanted someone to sit with her and not talk about anything. I don't say this to score points. I say it because it's true, and because it mattered later in ways I couldn't have predicted. During those 6 weeks, I was in that house almost every day. I saw my mother's medication bottles on the kitchen counter. I saw the mail pile up, bills, a few things from a law office I didn't recognize, a bank statement from an account I'd never heard of. I didn't open anything. It wasn't mine to open. But I noticed. I have always noticed things. It is, I think, the one advantage of having spent a childhood learning to read a room for signs of where I stood in it. One afternoon in April, while my mother napped, I answered the house phone because it wouldn't stop ringing and I was afraid it might wake her. It was Howard Ellis's office, confirming an appointment for Robert and Eleanor Bennett, Will and Trust Review, Thursday at 2. I can pass along the message, I told the receptionist. Do you want me to write anything down? No, that's all right, she said. Just a routine update. We'll see them Thursday. I did write it down. Not because I suspected anything yet, I want to be honest about that because honesty is the whole point of telling this story, but because I am a person who writes things down. It is, I would later understand, the single habit that saved me. That Thursday, I drove my mother to her physical therapy appointment at 11 and picked her up at noon. She asked me to drop her at Howard Ellis's office at 1:45 for a quick errand and to come back for her at 3. I didn't ask what the errand was. I assumed if I thought about it at all, that it was something related to her hip, a disability claim insurance paperwork. I had learned, over 4 decades, that asking direct questions in my family rarely got direct answers, and I had stopped expending the energy. I picked her up at 3. She seemed lighter, somehow not happier exactly, but relieved, the way you look after putting down something heavy. She didn't mention where she'd been. I didn't ask again. It would be almost 3 years before I understood what had happened in that building on that Thursday afternoon in April of 2021. By then, the paper trail was long enough that I could reconstruct it almost to the hour. But at the time, all I had was a note in my own handwriting on the back of a grocery receipt. H. Ellis Office, Robert Eleanor, Will Trust Review, Thursday 2 p.m. I kept that receipt. I don't fully know why even now. Some instinct in me, the same instinct that had been counting unequal Christmas presents since I was 7, understood, before the rest of me caught up, that this was a detail worth keeping. Christmas 2021. We spent Christmas Eve at Cherry Street, the way we always had. Rachel had redone her hair a honey blonde that made my mother compliment her 3 separate times before we'd even taken our coats off. Nathan, 6 years old that year, tore through presents under the tree with the gleeful chaos of a kid who has never once wondered whether he'll get what he asked for. Sophie, 11, and Ben, 7, waited their turn with the patient good manners I drilled into them, the same manners that had been drilled into me. The gifts, when they came, told their own quiet story the way they always did. Nathan got a tablet, a remote control drone, and an envelope that Daniel opened for him and read aloud with a laugh. A check for the Youth Hockey League, made out for an amount I glimpsed but didn't ask about. Sophie got a gift card to a bookstore and a sweater. Ben got a board game and $20 in a card. I want to be honest, I didn't say anything that night. I smiled. I thanked my parents. I told myself, as I had told myself at every holiday for 4 decades, that gifts weren't a scoreboard, that my children were loved regardless of what was in the boxes under the tree, that I was being petty even noticing. It was later that night, after the kids had fallen asleep in the car on the drive home, that Mark said the thing that stuck with me. We were sitting in our driveway, engine off, neither of us ready to go inside and end the day. Did you hear what your dad said to Daniel? Out on the porch when he thought everyone else was inside. I hadn't. I'd been in the kitchen with my mother, washing the good dishes by hand because she didn't trust the dishwasher with them. He said, "The cottage deed's done, by the way. Howard filed it last month. It's yours now officially whenever you want to use it." I sat very still in the passenger seat. "Yours," I repeated. "Not ours." "That's what I heard," Mark said. I figured maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it's still in both your names and your dad was just talking loosely. I called my father 2 days later on the pretense of thanking him again for Christmas, and asked as casually as I could manage, "Dad, did something happen with the cottage?" Mark thought he heard you mention a deed. There was a pause on the line, just slightly too long to be nothing. "It's a technical thing," my father said. "For liability. Your mother and I wanted someone actively managing it, keeping up the taxes and the insurance since we're getting older and can't make the drive up there like we used to. Daniel's closer, he's got the time. It doesn't change anything about what happens down the road. You'll still get your fair share when the time comes. But the deed is in his name, not both of ours. Claire. My father's voice took on the flat, closing tone I knew well. I'm not going to argue legal paperwork with you over the phone. Everything's going to be fine. You're always looking for something to worry about. That last sentence, you're always looking for something to worry about, is one I would turn over in my mind for the next 2 years the way you run your tongue over a chipped tooth. It wasn't just dismissive. It was a redirection, a small piece of psychological sleight of hand I hadn't fully clocked as a pattern until much later. Whenever I asked a direct question about money, the conversation would somehow become about my character instead. I wasn't asking a reasonable question. I was being anxious, difficult, ungrateful. I let it go. Again. I told myself the deed was probably, as my father said, a technical liability matter. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went back to my life, my job, my kids, the rhythm of a Tuesday evening spent helping Ben with long division at the kitchen table. And I did not, for another year and a half, ask another direct question about the cottage, the company, or my parents' will. But I kept the grocery receipt with the note about Howard Ellis's office. I added the date of this conversation to a note on my phone, in an app I'd started using without quite admitting to myself why. I called it, with a kind of grim humor I didn't share with anyone, Family Notes. It would eventually run to 11 pages. The loan. In February of 2022, Mark and I asked my parents for help, the only time in our marriage we ever did. Our furnace had died in the coldest week of the year, and between replacing it and a medical bill from Ben's broken arm that our insurance had only partially covered, we were short. We asked for $4,000, offered to sign something formal, offered interest. My father said, "Family doesn't charge family interest, Claire, don't be ridiculous," and wrote us a check the same week. We paid it back in full within 8 months in 4 installments, each one confirmed by a text message from my mother. Got it, thank you, sweetheart. I mention this because of what I learned 18 months later about Daniel's loan, the one for his East Grand Rapids house, the forgivable loan from 2015 that nobody had ever discussed the terms of in front of me. I found out through a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear at a family barbecue in June of 2022, that the loan, which I now knew from an offhand comment of Rachel's, had been $85,000, had been formally forgiven in full in December of 2020, the same season my father restructured the company. Forgiven. Not repaid over years the way ours had been. Simply erased with what I would later learn was a single line in the trust documents Howard Ellis had drawn up, treating it as an advance against Daniel's future inheritance rather than a debt at all, a designation that, I would come to understand, mattered enormously, because an advance against inheritance is supposed to be subtracted from a person's eventual share. I found no evidence later that it ever was. I did the math sitting in a lawn chair at that barbecue, half listening to Rachel talk to my mother about kitchen renovations, my paper plate of potato salad going warm in the sun. $85,000 forgiven outright. Our $4,000 repaid on schedule with a thank you text for every installment. I didn't say anything that day either. I want you to understand how deep this pattern ran in me, that even with a number that concrete, that undeniable, my first instinct was still to swallow it, to tell myself there was context I didn't have, that it wasn't my business, that raising it would make me the difficult one at a barbecue where everyone else was having a nice time. But I did something different that night when we got home. I opened the note on my phone, the one labeled Family Notes, and I wrote down the number. $85,000. Forgiven December 2020. I wrote down the date of the barbecue and who had said what. And then, for the first time, I wrote something that wasn't just a fact. I wrote a question to myself, the first real crack in 4 decades of telling myself it was fine. Why do I keep finding out about money after the fact? I didn't have an answer yet. But writing the question down was its own kind of decision, even if I didn't recognize it as one at the time. The wedding. In July of 2022, my cousin Melissa, Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim's daughter, got married at a vineyard outside Traverse City, and the whole extended family gathered for the first time in years outside of a holiday. Aunt Carol is my father's younger sister, 74 that year, a retired elementary school teacher with a gift for saying exactly the thing everyone else is thinking but too polite to say. She and Uncle Jim had driven up from Toledo, and I remember finding her on the vineyard stone patio during the cocktail hour, a glass of white wine in her hand, watching the rest of the family with the particular detached amusement of someone who had spent 40 years teaching second grade, and had therefore seen every version of sibling rivalry there was to see. "You look tired, Claire Bear," she said, using the nickname she called me since I was small. "More tired than a wedding should make a person." "It's been a busy year," I said, which was true and also nothing. She studied me for a moment over the rim of her glass. "Your father's been different since his scare in the spring. Softer in some ways. More closed off in others. Has he talked to you about the business? The cottage?" I felt something in my chest go very still. "Why do you ask?" "No reason in particular," she said in a tone that suggested there was in fact a reason, but one she wasn't ready to name outright. "Your grandfather did something similar, you know. With your father and me. Left the business to Robert outright, gave me a savings bond and a hug. I was 26. It took me until I was nearly 50 to stop being angry about it, and even then I'm not sure stopped is the right word so much as got tired of carrying it." "I didn't know that," I said. "Nobody in this family talks about money while it's happening," Carol said. "We only talk about it 40 years later at weddings after enough wine. It's a family tradition nobody ever wrote down on purpose." She patted my arm. "I'm not saying anything's wrong, sweetheart. I'm saying, keep your eyes open. And if you ever do find something you need to talk about, you call me. I've been where you might be standing. I know the shape of it." I didn't tell her that night about the note on my phone, the grocery receipt in my kitchen drawer, the deed conversation from the driveway 2 Christmases earlier. I wasn't ready yet to say those things out loud to anyone, even someone offering so plainly to listen. But I filed her words away the way I filed everything else that mattered, carefully, and for later. The reception itself was its own small window into the family's patterns. Daniel gave a toast for Melissa that was warm, well-delivered, and roughly 4 minutes long, the kind of easy public performance he'd always been good at. My mother cried happy tears and told 3 different tables of guests how proud she was of her children. Plural, generous, the same public voice she used for anyone outside the family. Rachel, seated beside me at dinner, spent 20 minutes describing a kitchen renovation on the East Grand Rapids house. New quartz countertops, a wine fridge built into the island, with the easy, unself-conscious confidence of someone who had never once had to wonder whether a purchase like that was reasonable. "You and Mark should renovate your kitchen," Rachel said at one point, not unkindly, simply oblivious. "It would probably do wonders for your resale value." "Maybe someday," I said, and meant it as the closing of the subject that it was. I danced with Ben, who was 8 that summer, standing on my feet the way small children do, and watched Sophie, 12, sit at the kids' table with Nathan, patient with him in a way that made me proud and in some small unexamined corner of myself a little sad, because I recognized, watching her, the same instinct in her that I'd spent my whole childhood cultivating in myself. The instinct to make things easy for everyone else, first, before anything else got considered. I made a private promise to myself on the drive home that night, somewhere on I-75 South with the kids asleep in the back seat, that I would find a way to unteach her that instinct before it cost her what it had cost me. I didn't yet know that unteaching it in myself would have to come first. The hospital. On a Tuesday morning in September of 2022, my father had what the emergency room doctor called a transient ischemic attack. A mini-stroke, the kind that resolves within hours but is, medically speaking, a 5-alarm warning that a larger stroke may follow. My mother found him disoriented in the kitchen, unable to find the right words for simple things, his face drooping slightly on one side. She called an ambulance. She called me from the hospital waiting room, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I left work without finishing a client presentation I'd spent 3 weeks on. I picked Sophie and Ben up early from school and dropped them at a neighbor's. I was at Spectrum Health within 40 minutes and I stayed there through the CT scan, the neurologist consult, the overnight observation, the follow-up appointments over the next 2 weeks, in a way that, looking back, I understand now was less about being needed and more about being unable, even in a crisis, to imagine not showing up. Daniel arrived at the hospital 4 hours after my mother's first call, having, as he explained, been in back-to-back showings he couldn't get out of. He stayed 40 minutes. He said, standing at the foot of our father's hospital bed, in a tone I think he genuinely believed was comforting, "You're tough, Dad. You'll bounce back." Then he left to pick Nathan up from hockey practice. I don't share this to condemn Daniel as a person who doesn't love our father. I think he does, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has never had to prove his love through labor, because labor was never asked of him. But I noticed, sitting in that hospital hallway at 11 at night with a vending machine coffee going cold in my hands, that I had spent my entire adult life being the proof of something: reliability, love, family, loyalty, that Daniel had never once been required to prove. My father recovered well from the TIA, though the neurologist was blunt about the odds of recurrence and the importance of managing his blood pressure. It was, everyone agreed, a wake-up call. My mother started talking more urgently now about getting things finalized, the will, the trust, so nobody has to sort through a mess. I offered, more than once over the following months, to help. I have a marketing background, not a legal one, but I know how to organize information, how to build a spreadsheet, how to keep a project on track. Let me help you get your documents organized, Mom. I can make a binder, a checklist, whatever would be useful. Oh, we've got it handled, sweetheart, she said each time. Howard's very thorough. I did not, at that point, know how thorough Howard Ellis actually was. I would find out. But it would take another year, and it would take a moment I never saw coming. A moment that arrived not because I went looking for it, but because my father, of all people, made a mistake he never intended to make. The group chat. There was a family group text, Bennett Fam. Rachel had named it years earlier, complete with a pumpkin emoji nobody ever explained. That had become, by 2023, the main channel through which I learned most family news. Photos from Nathan's hockey games. Reminders about whose turn it was to bring what to which holiday. My mother's occasional forwarded inspirational quote, usually about gratitude or family, that none of us ever knew quite how to respond to. In late January of 2023, I noticed, the way you notice a draft coming from somewhere in a house you thought was sealed, that a separate thread had started appearing in small references within the main chat. Talk to Howard about the Q1 numbers, Daniel wrote once, tagging only my father. Let's do dinner, just the three of us, to go over the trust stuff, my mother wrote another time, and I watched the message sit there, addressed to my father and Daniel, while I read it silently from my own phone, uninvited, unmentioned, present only as a witness to an invitation I hadn't received. I asked Mark one night whether I was being paranoid, whether just the three of us plans were really significant, or whether I was reading conspiracy into ordinary scheduling. I don't know if it's a conspiracy, Mark said carefully, but I've noticed it too. There does seem to be a version of this family that exists without you in it, and everyone acts like that's just how logistics worked out. I started keeping screenshots. Not obsessively. I want to be clear, I wasn't building a shrine to my own exclusion, checking my phone every hour for evidence. But when something relevant appeared, I saved it, the same instinct that had me keeping the grocery receipt 2 years earlier. By spring, I had a folder of 9 screenshots, 5 references to meetings or calls involving just the three of us, 2 mentions of documents being reviewed that I was never sent, 1 instance of my mother accidentally replying, all to something clearly meant only for Daniel, and immediately deleting it, though not before I'd already seen the notification preview on my lock screen. A line about the cottage insurance renewal addressed only to him. None of it on its own proved anything. That was the maddening part, and I understood even then why patterns like this are so hard to name out loud to the people living inside them with you. Every individual piece had an innocent explanation. Of course Daniel handled the cottage insurance. He owned the cottage. Of course my parents met with Howard Ellis without me. It was their estate, not mine, not yet. Each thread pulled alone frayed into nothing. It was only the whole cloth, all the threads together, that showed a shape. I didn't confront anyone about the group chat. I simply kept collecting, and I noticed with a kind of clinical detachment I was only beginning to recognize as a coping mechanism, that I had stopped expecting to be included in things before I'd even fully admitted to myself that I'd noticed the exclusion. Some part of me had already adjusted the temperature of what I expected from my own family, the way you adjust to a cold room without ever consciously deciding to put on a sweater. Sophie's graduation. In June of 2023, Sophie graduated 8th grade with a National Junior Honor Society cord, and a scholarship offered to a private high school's summer enrichment program that we genuinely couldn't afford without help. I mentioned it carefully to my mother. Not as a request, just as news, the kind of update I'd always shared. That's wonderful, my mother said. You should be proud. Nothing further came of it. We found a payment plan on our own, Mark and I, tightening the budget for 4 months to make it work. 3 weeks later, Nathan turned 9, and my parents rented a private room at a trampoline park, hired a face painter, and gave him as his main gift a check for $2,000 to start a savings account for his future, An amount my mother mentioned to me directly, unprompted, with visible pride, as though she expected me to be pleased on Nathan's behalf. I was pleased on Nathan's behalf. He's a sweet kid and none of this was his doing. But I remember standing in my kitchen after that phone call, staring at the calendar on the fridge, Sophie's payment plan due date circled in blue marker, and feeling something in my chest that wasn't quite anger. It was closer to grief. The grief of finally fully believing something I'd spent a lifetime refusing to believe, that the scale had never once been level, and it was never going to level itself. I didn't call my parents to complain. I didn't post anything passive-aggressive online, the way Rachel sometimes did about her own family. I did the only thing that had ever felt like it was actually mine to do. I opened my family notes and I wrote it all down: the tutoring, the hockey rink, the loan forgiven, the loan repaid, the cottage deed, the $2,000, Sophie's payment plan. And for the first time I organized it by date in a real document on my laptop, not just my phone. I titled it, without any irony I could detect at the time, Timeline. I didn't know yet what the timeline was for. I only knew that I needed, finally, after 40 years, to see the whole shape of it in one place. If you've been with me this far, thank you for sticking around. This is usually where I remind you to hit subscribe if you haven't already, because the story is about to change gears. Everything I've told you so far was the slow build. What's coming next is the part where Claire stops wondering and starts finding out. Stay with me. The laptop. In October of 2023, my mother asked me to come by Cherry Street on a Tuesday afternoon to help her set up a new laptop. My father was at a cardiology follow-up, Rachel had recommended a computer store, and my mother, 68 years old and proudly, stubbornly unwilling to learn anything about technology she hadn't already mastered by 1995, wanted me to transfer her files and get her email working before my father got home and, in her words, makes it worse trying to help. I sat at the kitchen table with her old laptop and her new one side by side, moving photos, bookmarks, the handful of documents she actually used. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind I'd done for her a dozen times before with a dozen devices. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be completely honest about that because it matters. I was not snooping. I was doing exactly what she'd asked me to do. Her old laptop's desktop was cluttered the way older people's desktops often are. Dozens of icons with no folders, no organization. Scrolling through to make sure I'd captured everything before wiping the machine to donate it. As she'd requested, I saw a file named simply Estate. Do not delete, last modified 3 months earlier. I almost skipped it. I want you to understand that. There was a version of that Tuesday afternoon where I never opened that file, where I finished the laptop transfer, made my mother a cup of tea, and drove home none the wiser, and my whole life afterward would have gone a different way. But I had spent a year, without fully admitting it to myself, building a timeline on my own laptop alone at night after the kids were in bed. Some part of me was already looking. I opened the file. It was a spreadsheet. Eleanor Bennett was many things, but a careful record keeper was not one I would have guessed. And I understood immediately, looking at the columns, that she hadn't built it, Howard Ellis's office had, and sent it to her as a summary, the kind of document an estate attorney prepares so clients can review the state of their affairs before signing anything. The spreadsheet had 4 columns: asset, current owner beneficiary, value estimated, and notes. The cottage on Higgins Lake. Transferred to Daniel R. Bennett, June 2020. Value estimated at $410,000. Bennett Construction LLC. 60 controlling interest transferred to Daniel R. Bennett, August 2020. Remaining 40 held in Bennett Family Trust with Daniel R. Bennett named sole trustee. Estimated total company value: $2.1 million. The East Grand Rapids residence loan. $85,000, forgiven December 2020, classified as advance against inheritance, not subtracted from residual estate per client instruction. I read that line 3 times. Not subtracted from residual estate per client instruction. My father had specifically instructed his attorney that the $85,000 Daniel received would not count against whatever Daniel would eventually inherit. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't Howard Ellis's mistake. It was a decision written down, dated, deliberate. The Cherry Street house itself, the house I'd grown up in, the house we were sitting in at that exact moment, was listed as part of the residual estate, to be split evenly between Daniel and me. So was a modest investment account worth, according to the spreadsheet, about $90,000. I did the arithmetic in my head, sitting at that kitchen table with my mother humming to herself as she tried to remember her old email password. The cottage. 410,000 entirely Daniel's already. The company. 2.1 million, 60% already Daniel's outright. The other 40% controlled by Daniel as sole trustee, even though it was nominally family. The forgiven loan. 85,000, specifically excluded from counting against his future share. What was left for the even split my father had promised at that kitchen table in 2019? The house we were sitting in worth generously maybe 200,000 in that market, and 90,000 in an investment account. $290,000 split two ways was my actual inheritance. $145,000, set against roughly $2.6 million in assets my brother had already received or fully controlled. I did not say anything to my mother. My hands, I remember, were completely steady, which surprised me. I'd expected if I ever found something like this that I'd shake or cry or feel the room tilt. Instead, I felt something colder and clearer, a kind of stillness I recognized distantly from childhood. The same stillness I used to feel writing my spelling words extra carefully the night my father said he'd wanted a son. I took out my phone, and while my mother searched a kitchen drawer for a post-it with her old password on it, I photographed every line of that spreadsheet, for separate photos to make sure the text was legible. I finished setting up her new laptop. I made her tea. I stayed another 40 minutes talking about nothing, about Nathan's hockey schedule and Sophie's new braces. And when I drove home, I did not cry until I was parked in my own driveway with the engine off, the same driveway where, 2 years earlier, Mark had told me about the cottage deed. I called Mark inside to tell him what I'd found. I did not call my parents. I did not call Daniel. I sat at my kitchen table that night after the kids were asleep, and I opened my timeline document, and I began methodically to attach every piece of evidence I could find to every entry already on the list. I did not yet know what I was going to do, but for the first time in my life I understood with total clarity exactly where I stood. The decision. For 3 weeks after I found the spreadsheet, I told almost no one. I went to work. I made dinner. I helped Ben with a science fair project on water filtration, and sat through Sophie's freshman orientation night. I called my mother on our usual Sunday schedule and talked about nothing, and my voice, I'm told, did not change at all. But something in me had gone very quiet in a different way than usual, not the practiced quiet of swallowing something, but the watchful quiet of a person deciding what to do with a piece of information large enough to reshape everything around it. The first person I told was my best friend, Patricia Nguyen. We'd met in college, stayed close through 2 decades of different cities and different lives, and she'd become, over the years, a family law attorney at a firm downtown. Not she was always careful to clarify an estate attorney, but close enough to the world of wills and trusts that she understood the terrain. I told her everything, sitting in her office after hours on a Thursday, the 4 photographs of the spreadsheet pulled up on my phone between us. Okay, she said, when I'd finished, in the calm, assessing voice I remembered from every crisis we'd navigated together since we were 20. First, I'm sorry. I know that's not a legal opinion, but I want to say it anyway because that's a lot to sit with. Thank you, I said, and found to my own surprise that I meant it more than I expected to. Second, legally you need to know, your parents are alive and this is their money. As long as they're competent, they can leave their estate to whoever they want, however they want, and there's very little you could do about it even if you wanted to, which, do you want to? I hadn't let myself ask that question directly yet. I don't want to sue my parents, I said. I don't want to fight Daniel in court. I don't think I even want the money to be split exactly 50-50 at this point. That ship might have sailed. I stopped because I genuinely didn't know how to finish the sentence. Take your time, Patricia said. I want them to stop lying to me, I said finally. I want to stop being the only person in my family who doesn't know what's actually happening with my own life. I've spent 40 years being told we'll even things out eventually, and I found out 3 weeks ago that they decided not 2 years ago and never told me. That's the thing I can't get past. Not the money. The lying. Patricia nodded slowly. That's not a legal problem, Claire. That's a family problem. But I can help you with the legal side of it if it comes to that, and I think given what you've described it might be worth talking to an actual estate attorney, someone who isn't Howard Ellis, just so you understand your position clearly before you do anything. Not to fight. Just to know where you stand. She referred me to a colleague, Thomas Reyes, an estate and trust attorney with 22 years of practice, who I met with 2 weeks later. I brought the photographs, my timeline document, by then 14 pages long, and the grocery receipt with Howard Ellis's office number on it, which I'd kept still in a drawer in my kitchen for reasons I could finally name. Thomas Reyes was unhurried in a way I found calming. He read through everything I'd brought, asked careful questions, and told me, in the end, something that reframed the entire situation for me. Your parents are, as far as I can tell from what you've shown me, entirely within their legal rights, he said. Parents don't owe their children an equal inheritance, and the law generally respects a competent person's right to distribute their assets however they choose, even if the reasoning behind it never gets explained to the people affected. If your father is still competent, and it sounds like he is, there's no fraud here, no undue influence I can identify from these documents alone, nothing a court would touch. So there's nothing I can do. There's nothing you can do legally, and I want to be honest with you about that so you don't waste money or energy chasing a case that doesn't exist. But, he said, sliding my timeline document back across the desk to me, what you have here isn't really a legal document. It's a record of a pattern. And patterns are useful for something other than lawsuits. They're useful for having an honest conversation that the people involved have been avoiding for a very long time. If that's what you're actually after, an honest conversation, not a legal remedy, this is more than enough to have it. I left his office with a strange, unfamiliar feeling, relief. Not because I'd found a path to some legal victory, there wasn't one and I hadn't really wanted one, but because for the first time a person with real expertise had looked at my life and confirmed that I wasn't crazy, wasn't being petty, wasn't imagining a pattern where there wasn't one. The pattern was real. It had a shape. It had dates and dollar amounts. I also, in that same month, started seeing a therapist, a woman named Grace Okafor whom Patricia had recommended years earlier and I'd never quite gotten around to calling. I told her in our first session that I didn't think I needed grief counseling or anything dramatic. I just needed help thinking clearly about a family situation. Tell me about the situation, she said, and I talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and at the end of it she said something I've carried with me since. It sounds like you've spent your whole life being the family's stability, and you're now realizing that stability was never reciprocated. That's not a small thing to realize at 42. It's going to take some time to grieve even if nobody died. Grieve what, exactly? The story you told yourself about your family, she said. The one where it was fair, even if it didn't always feel fair. You're allowed to grieve that story ending, even while you build a truer one. I also, almost by accident, ended up talking about it with Linda Foster, my supervisor at the marketing agency, and, over 11 years of working together, something closer to a mentor than a boss. Linda was 60. Blunt in the particular way of women who had spent their careers being underestimated in rooms full of men and had stopped apologizing for taking up space decades earlier. We were finishing a late night ahead of a client pitch when she noticed I'd been distracted for weeks and asked, without much preamble, what was going on. I told her the short version, mostly because I was tired and it was 10 at night and the truth was easier than inventing something smaller. Linda listened, then said something that stayed with me longer than almost anything Thomas Reyes or Grace had told me. You know what I see watching you work? You build a business case better than anyone on this floor. You gather the data, you anticipate the objections, you present it calmly, and you never once raise your voice, and it works every single time because people trust a person who isn't performing panic. You've been doing that for this agency for 11 years. She tapped the folder on my desk. Unrelated. A client's quarterly numbers with one finger. Do the same thing for your own life. Stop waiting for it to feel like a crisis before you treat it like a project. You already know how to do this. You've just never given yourself permission to use the skill on your own behalf. It was such a small thing to say, and it landed with the force of something much larger, because it reframed the entire 11 months of preparation ahead of me. The deeds, the filings, the conversations with Diane Cole. Not as an act of betrayal against my family, which was the frame my anxiety kept offering me at 2 in the morning, but as competent, ordinary work, the same kind of work I did every day for people who paid me to do it, and had never once questioned my right to do it well. I also spent one afternoon that winter with a financial advisor, Priya Malhotra, whom Mark had worked with professionally for years, mostly to understand in concrete terms what our own financial picture actually looked like: retirement accounts, Sophie and Ben's modest college funds, what we could realistically expect to need from any inheritance versus what we could build ourselves regardless of what happened with my parents' estate. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most stabilizing conversations of that entire year. "You are not financially dependent on this inheritance," Priya told me, showing me our own numbers on her screen. "Whatever you decide to say to your family, say it as someone who is going to be fine either way. That's not nothing. That's leverage most people in your position don't have, and you should use it, not as a threat, just as a source of calm." Mark, through all of this, was steady in the way he'd always been. Not pushing me toward any particular action, but making it clear repeatedly that whatever I decided, he was with me. "You don't owe them a confrontation," he told me one night, "and you don't owe them silence either. Whatever you do, do it because it's right for you, not because you're trying to win something." It took me nearly 2 more months through Thanksgiving, which I got through that year without saying a word, watching my parents and Daniel with a new and uncomfortable clarity, before I understood what I actually wanted to do. I didn't want a lawsuit. I didn't want a scene. I wanted the truth to exist out loud in a room where everyone could hear it at the same time, instead of in fragments only I seemed to be collecting. I decided I would wait until the next Thanksgiving 2024. And I would use the year in between to make sure that when I finally spoke, I would have everything I needed to say it once, clearly and completely, without needing to say it twice. Building the file. Over the following 11 months, I did the quiet, unglamorous work of preparation, the same way I'd once organized my mother's 70th birthday or built a client presentation from scratch. I've always been good at this, not the confrontation itself, but the architecture underneath it. I requested, through Michigan's Public Records Office, the recorded deed transfer for the Higgins Lake Cottage, which confirmed the June 2020 date and Daniel's sole ownership. No complicated legal maneuvering required, deeds are public record once filed. I found the corporate filing for Bennett Construction's 2020 restructuring through the state's business registry, confirming the 60% transfer and the family trust structure with Daniel as sole trustee. Neither of these documents was secret. They had simply never been shown to me, and I had never known to look. I asked my mother, casually, over several conversations spread across the winter and spring, small questions that built on each other without ever tipping into confrontation. Questions about the loan for Daniel's house, about the cottage taxes, about how Bennett Construction's insurance worked now that Daniel ran it. Each answer she gave me I wrote down, dated, and compared against the documents I already had. She never once lied to me directly in these conversations, I want to be clear. She simply answered narrowly, the way she always had, offering exactly as much as the question required and not one fact more. It was Diane Cole, my father's longtime bookkeeper before his retirement, who filled in several gaps I couldn't get from public records. I ran into her by chance at a grocery store in April, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee, and after a few minutes of easy small talk I asked, as evenly as I could manage, whether she'd be willing to sit down with me sometime and talk about the old days at Bennett Construction. She studied me for a moment. Diane had known me since I was in elementary school, had watched me grow up around that business the way you watch a neighbor's kid grow up, and said, "You found something, didn't you?" It wasn't really a question. We met the following week at a coffee shop on the east side, away from anywhere either of our families might run into us, which felt at the time like an unnecessary precaution and in hindsight like exactly the right one. Diane was 63 by then, retired 2 years, sharp as ever about numbers even if she claimed her memory for names had started to slip. I always felt strange about how quiet everyone kept you out of the business side of things, she told me, stirring sugar into her coffee with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years doing 2 things at once. "Daniel was in the office every day, sure, but you were the one who actually understood how to read a PL statement. I used to think more than once that your father had the wrong kid running the numbers." She confirmed the loan amount, $85,000 exactly, wired to Daniel and Rachel in 3 installments between March and June of 2015, and told me something I hadn't had before. That in early 2022, after my father's TA, he had called Howard Ellis's office and asked, according to what Diane had heard secondhand from Howard's paralegal, whether language could be added to the trust requiring Daniel to make things right with Claire eventually, at his discretion. Howard talked him out of it, Diane said. Said it was too vague to be enforceable and too specific to be comfortable. Daniel would resent a debt he couldn't quantify, and Claire, if she ever found the document, would resent being owed something so undefined. Your father dropped it. I don't think it ever made it into anything final. I sat with that for a long moment, turning my own coffee cup in slow circles the way my father did with his. an inherited habit I'd never noticed until that moment. So he knew, I said. After the TIA, at least he knew it wasn't right. I think he'd known longer than that, Diane said, not unkindly. I think your father is the kind of man who knows things a long time before he's ready to do anything about them. That's not an excuse. I just think it's true, and I think it might matter to you, eventually, to know the difference between a man who never noticed and a man who noticed and stalled. It did matter. It has continued to matter, in the years since, more than almost anything else I learned that spring. That detail mattered to me more than almost anything else I found. It meant my father knew. At some level, even amid all the transfers and forgiven loans, some part of my father understood that what was happening to me wasn't fair, and had tried, in his own inadequate hedge-everything way, to leave a door open for a version of fairness he never had the courage to build directly. It didn't excuse what had happened, but it changed the shape of my anger, softened one of its edges, in a way I hadn't expected and was grateful for. I moved a modest inheritance from my mother's side of the family, $12,000 I'd received when my grandma Doris passed in 2019, and had left untouched in a separate account ever since, out of some instinct I hadn't examined at the time, into a solely owned account on Thomas Reyes's advice, simply so there would be no ambiguity about what was mine regardless of how the larger conversation went. Mark and I updated our own will that spring, naming guardians for Sophie and Ben and being, for the first time in our marriage, explicit and equal in how we structured things for our own children, a small act of correction that felt, in a private way, like its own kind of statement. I did not tell my parents or Daniel anything about what I was doing. I continued attending every family dinner, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday phone call, exactly as I always had. Grace, my therapist, asked me once whether the double life of it, collecting evidence quietly while smiling at the dinner table, felt dishonest to me. Did, at first, I told her. But I've realized something. I'm not being dishonest. I'm just declining to perform distress I haven't decided what to do with yet. There's a difference between lying and not being finished thinking. By October of 2024, my timeline document ran to 31 pages, cross-referenced with photographs, public filings, and dated notes going back 5 years. I printed 3 copies, one for myself, one I gave sealed to Patricia for safekeeping in case anything happens to mine, and one I plan to bring, though I hadn't yet decided in what form, to Thanksgiving. In September of 2024, 2 months before that Thanksgiving, I did one more thing I hadn't originally planned to do. I called Howard Ellis's office directly and asked for a meeting in my own name as a client, not as Robert and Eleanor Bennett's daughter calling to ask a favor, but as a person entitled, under Michigan law, to request a copy of any trust document in which I was named as a beneficiary. Howard Ellis was 71, silver-haired, precise in the way of a man who had spent 40 years being careful with other people's money and other people's secrets. His office, on the 4th floor of a building downtown, had a window overlooking the river and a wall of law books I suspected were mostly decorative. He seemed, when I arrived, genuinely uncertain how to greet me, friendly, since he'd known me since I was a teenager, but visibly aware that this visit was different from every other time our paths had crossed. "I'll be straightforward with you, Claire," he said, once we were both seated. "I have represented your parents for over 30 years. My duty is to them, not to you, and there are limits to what I can discuss without their consent." "I understand that," I said. "I'm not asking you to break any confidence. I'm asking, as a named beneficiary of the Bennett Family Trust, for a copy of the trust document itself. I believe that's a request I'm legally entitled to make." He was quiet for a moment, and I watched something shift in his face. Not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of a careful man realizing a corner he'd cut years earlier was finally being examined in daylight. "You are," he said finally. "You're right about that. I'll need to confirm the specifics with your parents before I release anything as a courtesy, but you do have that right." He paused. "For what it's worth, Claire, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to anyway because I'm 71 years old and I'm tired of being careful about everything. I raised concerns more than once over the years about how this was being structured. Your father makes his own decisions. I draft what I'm asked to draft. But I want you to know it wasn't for lack of anyone in that office ever asking the question." I appreciated the honesty, even as I understood exactly how much cover it gave him. A lawyer who'd voiced concerns privately while still drafting every document that ignored them wasn't quite the ally his tone implied. But I didn't say that to him. I simply thanked him, and left with a promise that the trust documents would be sent to me within the week, which they were, arriving by certified mail 8 days later, and matching, almost line for line, the spreadsheet I'd photographed on my mother's old laptop a year earlier. Seeing it in an official document, with Howard Ellis's letterhead and a notary's seal, did something the spreadsheet alone hadn't. It closed the last door I'd left open quietly, for the possibility that I'd misunderstood something, that there was context that would make the numbers mean something kinder than what they appeared to mean. There wasn't. The document said exactly what the spreadsheet had said. I read it twice at my kitchen table alone, and then I filed it calmly in the folder with everything else. I want to be honest about something here because it's the part of this story people ask me about most. I did not build that file because I wanted to destroy my family at a holiday dinner. I built it because I had spent 40 years being told, gently and repeatedly, that my perception of my own life was wrong, that I was imagining unfairness where there was none, that I was always looking for something to worry about. The file wasn't a weapon. It was proof, first and foremost for myself, that I hadn't been imagining anything at all. Whatever I decided to do with it, I was done doubting my own memory. Thanksgiving. We hosted Thanksgiving in 2024. It was, in fact, my turn in the rotation, a detail I'd thought about more than I probably needed to in the months of planning, because it meant that whatever happened would happen in my house at my table on ground where I didn't have to ask permission to speak. Everyone came. My parents, Daniel and Rachel and Nathan, Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim, who'd driven up from Ohio, Sophie and Ben moving between the kitchen and their rooms with the particular restlessness of teenagers forced into a long family gathering. Mark carved the turkey. My mother brought her pie crust, rolled between 2 sheets of wax paper, the way her mother had taught her. For the first 90 minutes it was, by every outward measure, an ordinary holiday. I waited until dessert. I thought carefully about the timing, not during the meal itself, when the mood was warm and I didn't want to poison it unnecessarily, not after everyone had scattered to the living room and the moment would feel scattered too. I waited until the plates were cleared and the pie was served and everyone was still gathered at the table, full and unhurried, the natural pause before people start thinking about leaving. Before everyone gets up, I said, I want to talk about something. I've been putting it off for a while, and I don't think putting it off any longer is doing anyone any favors. The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when they sense, before any specifics are given, that something real is about to happen. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Daniel glanced at Rachel. About a year ago, I said, I found out some things about how the estate has been set up. The cottage, the company, the loan for Daniel's house. I want to say clearly before anything else, I'm not here to fight about money, and I'm not here to demand anything be redone. What's done is legally done, and I've made my peace mostly with that part of it. I could see my father's face change. Not anger yet, something more like bracing. What I can't make peace with, I continued, my voice steady, the same steadiness I'd practiced alone in my car more times than I'd admit, is that I found out about all of it by accident. A spreadsheet I wasn't supposed to see. A deed I had to look up in public records. A loan amount I learned from a bookkeeper at a grocery store. Because nobody in this family ever thought I deserved to just be told. I slid a single folder across the table. Not the full 31 pages, just a summary sheet I prepared specifically for this, 6 lines, dates and dollar amounts, nothing editorial. This isn't a legal document. It's not a threat. It's just the truth laid out plainly. The way I wish someone had laid it out for me 5 years ago instead of letting me find it in pieces. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father didn't touch the folder. Claire, he said, this isn't the place. It's exactly the place, I said, and this is the line I know now because people have told me, because I've thought about it more than any other sentence I've ever spoken. That became the one thing everyone remembered afterward. You taught me my whole life that family doesn't air things out in public. But you also taught me, without ever saying it out loud, that some children's inheritance gets aired out at a lawyer's office in private, and others just get told eventually whatever version everyone's decided they can live with. I'm not angry that Daniel has more. I'm angry that I was the last to know I had less. Daniel, to his credit, and I want to give him this credit because it surprised me, didn't get defensive right away. He looked instead genuinely stricken, turning the summary sheet toward himself and reading it slowly. I didn't know it was structured like this, he said quietly. I mean, I knew about the loan. I knew about the cottage. I didn't know Dad told you it'd be split even. Nobody told me that either. That's the part one need you all to understand, I said. Nobody's the villain here in the way villains work in movies. But something still happened that wasn't fair. And I'm allowed to say that out loud without it being a betrayal of the family. I've spent my whole life being the one who keeps things smooth. I'm not doing that today. I love all of you. That's actually why I'm saying this instead of just quietly resenting you for another 20 years. My mother started to cry. Not dramatically, just a thin, silent leaking of tears she wiped with her napkin. The way she'd wipe away any inconvenience. We always meant to even it out, she said. Your father's health scared us and Howard said we needed to move quickly and Daniel needed more help, he always has, and I thought there'd be time to explain it to you properly, and then there just never was a good time. There's never a good time to tell someone something hard, I said. I know that better than anyone at this table. But you have to tell them anyway, eventually, or the not telling becomes its own kind of lie. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Aunt Carol, who I would learn afterward had suspected some version of this for years and never felt it was her place to say anything, reached over and put her hand over my mother's. My father, finally, picked up the summary sheet, read it in silence, and set it back down with hands that weren't quite steady. I don't have anything to say that fixes this tonight, he said finally. But I heard you. I want you to know that. I heard every word. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It wasn't the redress I might have wanted at 25, if I'd found all this out at 25 instead of 42. But it was for my father, a man who had never once in my memory admitted to a mistake he couldn't immediately explain his way out of, as close to accountability as I had ever seen him come. I decided, sitting at my own table with my children watching from the kitchen doorway where they drifted, unnoticed partway through, that it would have to be enough for that night. Even if it wasn't enough for the rest of my life. The dinner ended quietly without slammed doors, without anyone storming out. Daniel hugged me at the door, longer than he usually did, and said, "I'm sorry, Claire. I mean it. I didn't see it, but I should have looked harder." My parents left holding hands, the way they always did, my mother's eyes still red. I stood in my kitchen afterward, washing the good dishes by hand the way my mother always had, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely unclenched. What came after? The months after that Thanksgiving were not, I want to be clear, a montage of easy healing. Real families don't resolve like that, and I wouldn't trust this story if I told you they did. My mother called me 3 days later and cried on the phone for 20 minutes, apologizing in the diffuse, unfocused way she apologized for everything. Sorry for the hurt, sorry for the timing, sorry I'd found out the way I did, but never quite arriving at a sentence that took ownership of the actual decisions that had been made. I told her gently that I appreciated the call, and that I needed some space over the next while to figure out what our relationship looked like going forward. She didn't understand why space was necessary if I'd already said what I needed to say. I explained as best I could that saying something out loud once doesn't undo 40 years of a pattern, and that I needed time to see what she did next, not just what she said. My father characteristically said less and did more. In January of 2025, without any prompting from me, he asked Howard Ellis to draft a codicil to his will, a formal amendment, establishing a clear cash bequest to me and to Mark, funded from his and my mother's remaining liquid assets, explicitly intended, the document stated, to address a disparity in prior gifts and transfers made to Daniel R. Bennett during my lifetime. It wasn't the $2.6 million Daniel had already received. It couldn't be. That money was gone, transferred, spent in some cases on Daniel and Rachel's own home renovations and Nathan's private school tuition. But it was $180,000, a real number deliberately chosen, my father told me over coffee one Saturday morning in February, to at least be a start of closing the gap, even though I know it doesn't close it all the way. Why now? I asked him. Why not 5 years ago when you first knew? He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. Because 5 years ago I told myself I still had time to fix it later, he said. And I kept telling myself that every year, until you sat me down and made me understand that later wasn't a plan. It was just a way of not deciding. It was the closest he ever came in so many words to admitting what he'd done. I took it. Daniel's response unfolded more slowly, and more unevenly. For the first few months he was attentive in a way that felt almost overcorrected, calling more often, inviting our family to more things, once even offering, awkwardly, to split something with me that I gently declined, because I didn't want the relationship rebuilt on a transaction, even a well-intentioned one. By spring, some of that intensity faded as it does, back into a more ordinary rhythm. Not distant but not performing guilt either. We had a real conversation in March, just the two of us over coffee, where he admitted that he'd spent most of his adult life not really looking at what he had versus what I had, because looking would have required him to sit with something uncomfortable about himself. I'm not going to pretend I'm going to give any of it back, he said. I've got a mortgage now that assumes the cottage, a business that assumes the company shares. I can't undo that even if I wanted to. But I can stop pretending I didn't know. And I can actually show up for you and your kids the way you've shown up for all of us for once. He has mostly kept that promise. He came to Ben's middle school graduation in June of 2025 and stayed the whole ceremony. He calls Sophie on her birthday now, not just sends a card through Rachel. It isn't everything. It isn't the $85,000 or the cottage or the company shares. But it's real in the way small consistent things are real, and I've come to believe that's worth more than a single grand gesture would have been. Rachel, for her part, never fully warmed to me after that Thanksgiving. I think she experienced the whole evening as an attack on her family's stability rather than a request for honesty, and some part of her has never quite forgiven me for it, though she's never said so directly. We're cordial. We'll never be close. I've made my peace with that too. Not everyone in the family took the news well. My mother's sister, my Aunt Linda, whom I'd always been fond of, sided firmly with my mother, telling me at a cousin's wedding the following summer that I'd embarrassed the family over money and should have handled it privately. I told her as calmly as I could manage that I had tried for 5 years to handle it privately, and that privacy had only ever protected the people who already had the advantage. She didn't have a response to that. We speak rarely now, and it's a loss but not one I regret absorbing. 6 months later. By the following June, the shock of that Thanksgiving had settled into something closer to a new normal. My mother and I found our way back to something resembling closeness, though it's a different shape than what we had before. Less automatic, more chosen. She stopped, almost entirely, saying we'll even things out eventually about anything, because there's nothing left to promise vaguely. The codicil is signed, specific, done. I think in a strange way the specificity was a relief to her too. Vague promises require constant maintenance. A finished document just sits there, true without needing to be managed. I started saying no to things I would never have said no to before, hosting every single holiday by default, being the one who always drove 2 hours to pick up a relative from the airport, absorbing the emotional labor of every family conflict that wasn't mine to solve. Not out of spite. Out of a slowly built understanding, mostly from my sessions with Grace, that being needed and being valued are not the same thing, and I had spent 4 decades confusing them. Sophie, who was in the kitchen doorway that Thanksgiving night and heard more of it than I realized at the time, asked me about it a few months later, doing homework at our kitchen table. Would you do it again? She asked. Say something like that at dinner? Yes, I told her. Not because it fixed everything. It didn't. But because I spent my whole life thinking that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the family together, and I don't think that's true anymore. I think you can love people and still tell them the truth, even when the truth makes dinner uncomfortable for one night. Grandma still seems sad about it sometimes, Sophie said. She is, I said. I think she's sad about a version of herself she has to look at now that she didn't have to look at before. That's not the same as me having done something wrong. 1 year later. By Thanksgiving of 2025, we were back in rotation at my parents' house on Cherry Street, the crooked porch steps still uncorrected, some things apparently permanent regardless of what else changes. It was, by every measure, a calmer holiday than the year before, not because the underlying history had been erased, but because it had finally been named, and named things are so much easier to sit beside than unnamed ones. Daniel brought up the cottage himself, unprompted, over coffee after the meal. You should bring your family up this summer, he said. It's still everyone's cottage, even with the deed the way it is. I want Nathan to grow up thinking of it that way, not just his. We went the last week of July and it felt for the first time in years like the place I remembered from childhood. The dock, the fireworks, the smell of my mother's pancakes on a griddle that had somehow impossibly survived 4 decades of use. Sophie taught Nathan to fish off the end of the dock, patient in a way that reminded me, with a small ache, of myself at her age. Ben and Daniel built a fire together and argued cheerfully about the right way to stack the wood. It wasn't perfect. There is no version of this story where it becomes perfect, I don't believe that version exists for any real family, only in the ones we tell ourselves we're supposed to have. But it was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, honest. And honest, it turns out, was the thing I'd actually been asking for all along underneath the spreadsheets and the deeds and the dollar amounts. Not equal. Just honest. 3 years later. It's been 3 years now since that Thanksgiving. My father's health has held steady, though the cardiologist watches him closely. My mother has taken up watercolor painting, of all things, and sends me photos of increasingly ambitious attempts at painting the lake. Daniel and I talk most weeks now, not out of guilt I don't think, but out of something closer to the relationship we might have had all along if the ground under us had been level from the start. Sophie is a senior in high school now, applying to colleges, and Mark and I have been careful, deliberately discussed out loud careful, to make sure whatever we're able to offer her and Ben in the years ahead is offered evenly, named clearly, promised in writing where writing matters. I don't ever want my children sitting at a kitchen table 40 years from now, doing arithmetic they were never supposed to have to do. I think about that Thanksgiving often, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of quiet gratitude for the version of myself who finally said the thing out loud. I spent 40 years believing that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. I know now that they are not the same thing at all. Sometimes the truest form of loyalty to a family isn't silence. It's the courage to say calmly at a table full of people you love, "I'm not angry that Daniel has more. I'm angry that I was the last to know I had less." And to trust that the people who really love you will still be sitting there when you're done saying it. They were. Not all of them and not perfectly, but enough of them. And it turned out to be enough. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. If any part of it felt familiar, if you've ever been the one who kept the peace while everyone else kept the assets, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. This channel exists because of stories like yours, so tell me your version, whatever it looks like. If this one meant something to you, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe if you haven't yet. It genuinely helps keep these stories coming every week. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of the truth. It's usually worth more than the silence.